All right, chapter 3, layers. In this chapter, we're going to make kind of a 1980s style photographics. Instead of doing a photograph, we're going to do it with paintings from the 1780s, so it'll be a little goofy. So let's take a look at some of these layers. I'm going to pull out this layers panel, and what we're going to do is explore the different ways that we can create these kind of edits to our image non-destructively. So we're going to add a text layer, obviously, and in that text layer, we're going to add some layer styles that will do things like add the stroke, gradient shadow, and drop shadow that make it look a little bit better. Then we're going to look at some ways of changing the appearance of an image. Like we have a little darkening effect down here at the bottom. We have a general image adjustment. We have a hue and saturation adjustment for this guy here in back. We have a hue saturation adjustment for the second guy. We've also got this goofy little texture that gets applied to the image to make it look a little bit more like a 1780s picture. And then, of course, we have a brightness and contrast adjustment to help change the overall appearance of the original image. We're also going to add in these two images, and we're adding them in. We're going to add them in a way that makes them transparent, so to help kind of give that ghostly feel that you would see in a lot of 1780s pictures. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to go ahead and close this, and we're going to open up our start file, which is going to be chapter 3 Ch3. So I'm going to go over to open. I'll go to 3. I will grab Ch3 or Ch3, whatever the name is, 1, and click open. If you haven't already dragged your layers panels out, so it should start down here, I would go ahead and drag it over to the right so we get a little blue line right there. And then to do yourself a favor, go ahead and pop open this panel right here, which is going to be our history panel. And this will be a way of tracking all the changes we make. First thing we want to do to this picture is we want to address some of the kind of cracking and other kind of dust that's in this original painting. So like if I zoom in, Command plus, oops, I'm on my notes, Command plus, we can see that there's a bunch of cracking in this from being an old picture. So we want to kind of quickly and easily remove that cracking. Luckily, Photoshop has a way of doing it really easily. So Command 0 to fit everything back on your screen. And I'm going to come up to Filter, and I'm going to go to Noise, and I'm going to go to Dust and Scratches. Dust and Scratches is a neat tool in that what it's going to do is it's going to look at area where there's basically contrasting pixels. Like if I turn preview off, and I click here, one, you can see the preview in the background. And then if I click on this, it will preview the change. So what this does is it looks at neighboring pixels based on the radius that I set right here. And it will move them to be closer together in appearance. Similarly, based on this threshold is like how different do they have to be before they start changing. So in this case, I want any sort of difference modified. And I'm going to do a radius of 1 because pretty quickly, especially here in the eye, we're already losing a little bit of detail at the 1 step. So if I went up to 2 step or 3 step, we can see that I'm losing a lot of detail, which does pretty thoroughly remove all of the stuff in the background. But 1 will look good enough for our processes today. Next, we want to make this look a little bit more like a 1980s picture. So a very common format that people would shoot in was 4x5. Nowadays, we mostly are shooting in 2x2 or 3, which is what you would see like in a normal digital camera, or 4:3, which is like your phone. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out, give myself a little bit of room to change this thing's aspect ratio. So Command or Control minus. And then I'm going to hold down the space bar and move it down here to the bottom right, because I want to expand this up to the top left. To do my expansion, I'm going to do it just the same way that we did in chapter 1. So I'm going to hit C for crop tool or click on it here. But unlike in chapter 1, I'm going to have to make a couple other adjustments for this to actually work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock this background layer. So this makes it so certain tools do not interact with this layer. And so we want to turn that off. Now, some tools that shouldn't be able to interact with this or didn't in the past automatically unlock it now. So if you're looking at older tutorials, that might be a difference that you see. But a pretty good rule of thumb is just unlock it. Next, up here in the top, we're going to pick, probably for you, it'll say ratio, but you want to pick 4x5, and that will load 4x5 here into your system. You can also flip it to switch to horizontal, but we want vertical, so we'll leave it at 4.5. Next, we're going to drag this out. And as I drag it out, we can see that I want to center the pointing hand to be about center in that column. So the hand pointing at us ends up about like so. So that nestles this hand well here. So we've got like a nice good line running through the center column. But right now, if we were going to do this, we'd end up with just transparent pixels. So unlike in chapter 1, when we expanded, we revealed an image. There's no more image here to reveal. So I need to tell Photoshop to make something up. In our case, we're going to come up to where it says fill, and we're going to pick content aware fill. Now we'll use generative stuff, which is their new AI that got launched recently in later chapters. But for now, we're going to use just content aware fill, which is their older version. The big difference between the two being that content aware fill will only use stuff that's in the picture to create the fill, while generative will use the AI generative system to kind of figure out what ought to be in there. So generative can put in new or novel things, while content aware will only put in things from your system. So pick content aware and then click done or the check mark or double click or hit enter, whatever gives you a giggle. Now it'll take it a hot second to process through that. And we can see that we ended up with a attractive expansion of our dude. Looks like I got a little bit of white line right here, so I'm going to crop that in just ever so slightly. Now, normally we'd want to remove this line right here because it's a little obvious, but once we start making our adjustments, it won't be quite as obvious. And we'll look at how we would remove stuff like that in chapter 6 when we're also looking at the liquefy tool and some other kind of removal tools available to us in Photoshop. Now, as we start digging into this, we're going to end up with a bunch of different kinds of layers. So let's make a couple of just kind of demo layers over here that we'll remove or get rid of here in a second. So first, let's add our 3 types of layers. So I can come down here to the bottom and I can click this half circle and we can see that I've got something called an adjustment layer. So these are all exactly what it sounds like. They will create an adjustment. In our case, let's grab brightness and contrast. And what a brightness and contrast adjustment allows me to do is to adjust the brightness or contrast present in the image using the sliders over here. Now, when I have this layer active, so it's highlighted in blue or gray, we can see that different things happen in my properties panel because the properties panel is the control for this adjustment layer. Next, let's take a look at a color fill. So I'm going to come back down to this area and I'll click on the half circle again, and I'm going to pick a solid color. So instead of being an adjustment, this is going to just add in a solid color. I'm just going to pick red for now. Doesn't matter what color you pick as long as it's not like black or white. So this little symbol right here tells me that this is an adjustment layer, and in this case, a brightness and contrast layer. This symbol right here tells me that this is a color layer. And what's neat about this is, notice one, I don't have any control for color over here, but if I double click on this layer, I get back to this color picker. So at any point, I can always double click on this and change my color, which is super helpful and super cool. Now I can change how much this layer is affecting the one underneath it by coming up here to where it says normal and picking a different blending mode. In this case, we can see that it would shift it green. I could also choose, and this is a pretty common way of changing color, soft light. And you can see that that adds in nice green tint to this. And I can change how much green tint is being added by changing the opacity. And you can think of opacity as like how transparent is my image. Now we'll dig into it a little bit more in a minute, but we have opacity and fill, and these do pretty much the same thing for most types of layers. There's a couple that will be a little different, and they're marked in the textbook. And then there's also when we add a layer style will not be affected by the fill slider, which is kind of cool. In this case, let's just go ahead and just set the opacity to 50 so it's not too green. Oops. You can always type in and you don't always have to use the slider. Next, make the T for text tool active. So over here, I've got T for text, and I can just click, boop, and we can just leave this as lorem ipsum. I'm not going to care that much about it. And we can see over here in my layers panel, I have a T for text. Now, as long as this says T for text, whenever I have the text tool active, I can click onto my text and change it. Now, there are ways to convert this to kind of like an image layer, and then you would lose the ability to type. So keep in mind that even though you might see text in your image, unless it is a T for text layer, you will not be able to go in and change. Now we can add things like strokes and other kind of fun, complicated things like that to a layer. And this is often done to a text layer using layer styles. So I'm going to finish my typing. So I'll click the check mark. And I have my text layer active. You can tell it's active again because it's highlighted in blue. And I'm going to come down to the bottom of my layers panel and I'll click the FX. And we can see that there's a bunch of options in here. Now we'll use blending modes later to kind of do like this cool fire effect in another chapter. For now, we're going to care about these other blending modes. And the first one I'm going to grab is stroke. And stroke is going to add a black line to the outside of anything that's in my layer. So I don't know, let's put in 50 or so, and nothing happened. Like it just turned the text black. So to make it visible, where it says position, I'll switch to outside, and we can see that gives me a nice little black outline around my text. We see this a lot in memes. Similarly, we can add a drop shadow, which helps make text a little bit more legible by staying in this layer style panel and clicking on drop shadow. And this does exactly what it sounds like. It adds a shadow. So just kind of click and drag some of these up. And let's rotate you. I'll set you to 100 so we can really see it. There it is. And so you can see that I'm getting a little shadow underneath my text. And just go ahead and click OK. If you don't have those settings in perfect, we're going to nuke this here in a second. Again, we're just looking at the different kinds of layers. Next, we're going to make the shape tool, hotkey U. And if we just click and drag, we get a shape. Now, this is a special kind of shape called a vector. And vector is going to be a new type of file that we're going to learn at the end of this chapter when we're done with our actual image. And what vectors are basically mathematical areas that we can assign fills and strokes to. And then one of the things that's really nice about assigning fills and stroke to is that at any point I can change its appearance non-destructively. And vectors are pretty cool. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a minute with file types, but vector layers will always have this kind of little symbol next to it, and it'll be pretty obvious over here in the character panel. Finally, let's just add another image. So we'll come up to File, and we'll go to Placed Embedded. And just grab one. I don't really care which one it is. Boop. And click Done. And now we have one more type of layer. Now this is just a normal raster layer. So a raster layer is an image that's going to be full of pixels. Like this could be like a drawing. This could be a picture. This could be, again, anything made up of pixels. Now this is a special kind of raster layer, because notice down here we have a raster layer for our layer 0, and we have a raster layer up here at the top of our layer panel, and it's got this little symbol in it that tells me that this is a smart object. So a smart object will retain certain types of editability, but also block certain types of editability. So as long as it's a smart object, I can resize it all I want without damaging or discarding pixels. Similarly, remember at the start when we used that dust and scratches layer, that technically was a destructive edit because we have no way of undoing that. If I did that to this one currently, so if I come up to Filter and Dust and Scratches and click OK, we can see that this little drop-down area appears underneath it, and that will only happen on layers that are smart objects. Now, it's really easy to turn something into a smart object just by coming up to Filter and doing Convert Smart Filters. And that, again, would allow you to come back and make those changes. So unlike on layer 0, I can now double-click on Dust and Scratches and be like, well, actually, I really wanted this to be a 5. And then later be like, wow, that 5 looks awful, and go back to 1. And I haven't damaged my image at all. Now, one big drawback of these, of course, is if I try to use something like the brush tool or a removal tool on it, I can't do it. It says no. I have to convert it back to a normal raster layer. All right, so that's a lot, but unfortunately, there's still more to go through in the layers panel. Nope, I don't want to do that. Okay, so we have all of our different kinds of layers, and let's collapse this down so it's a little bit easier to see. So I got this little arrow right here, so I can collapse these down, so I'm not looking at that stuff inside of there. Now, the layers panel itself has a bunch of really cool controls to it. So up here at the top where it says normal, I have all of my different kind of blending modes. Up here in the top right, I have basically my layers menu. I have this little eyeball next to my layer that allows me to temporarily hide a layer. I have my layer preview, and then I have my layer label. Now, something that can be very irritating when you're learning Photoshop is that clicking here versus clicking here can do different things. Like if I right-click on my layer preview, I get this pretty limited menu. But if I right-click on my layer name, I get this much larger menu akin to this one over here. Similarly, I have different things that I can add to a layer. So let's say I wanted to hide part of this. This is where we would make like a layer mask. And I get this white box. And again, anywhere that I put in black into this box starts hiding stuff. Now, something that you'll frequently see, oops, that was the healing tool. Let's add some black in there. There we go. Now, frequently what you'll see students do is they'll make a layer mask and then it doesn't work. And they'll come down and hit the layer mask a second time. And now they've got 2 masks in here. Now, unfortunately, these are not the same thing. So this one right here is a raster-based mask, and this one is a vector-based mask. We want to mostly use our raster masks in this chapter, so we're going to not hit the layer mask button twice. So this is where you'd want to undo a step, or you'd want to right click on the mask and say delete vector mask, or let's say this mask was wrong and you needed to redo that step, but you couldn't step back here in history. You would right click and do delete layer mask. Now notice that when I make a layer mask, I end up with a little chain link between here. This chain link is very important because it's the way that the move tool and certain other tools will interact between these two. So like if I grab the move tool and I click on this image and I move it around, that mask moves with the raster image. If I click the link off, I can move them separately from one another. Also notice that I can say I want the mask active versus the layer contents active by clicking between the two. Now, sometimes you want to not interact with a certain layer. So let's say I wanted this layer here, but I didn't want to hide it by poking it here in the eyeball. I could lock it, which prevents me from interacting with it and allows me to interact with other layers without having to accidentally click on or move the locked layer. So that can be a very handy way of doing it. And I've got different types of locks available to me. Similarly, I have layer filtering, so I can filter out to certain types of layers. Although my layer filtering is missing. I wonder why. Is this a change they just made? It is. Look at that. So here's a change they made since I wrote this chapter last year, is they hid my layer filtering. So I don't know why they did that by default now, but there you go. So you can also sort by certain types of layers. So I could be like, just give me my color layers only. In this case, this would be like a color label I would have made, which we don't have active. I could be like, I want to turn that on, none, and I could pick a different one. So I could be like kind of layer, or just show me my smart objects. I could turn that filter on and off, and it will give me just smart objects. Let's go ahead and just switch you back to hide. And you know what? Actually, I'd like that off. I'm going to hide that. Hide. That's interesting. I wonder why they made that change. Okay, down here at the bottom, I have a way of re-adding locks that I've turned off. I have that layer styles panel. I have my layer mask button. I have my adjustment layer button. I have my grouping button. We'll use this later in the chapter book, but not this chapter. We'll use it later in the book where you can make multiple layers active and group it into a single thing. Then I have my new layer button, which just gives me an empty layer. And then I have my delete layer button, which allows me to delete layers. Okay, let's get back to where we're actually doing some editing and get rid of all this kind of demo stuff. Now notice that each time I've made a change in my document, I have gotten a new step over here in my history panel. And again, if your history panel is not visible, you might just need to click it open, or if you've accidentally closed it, you'll come up to Window and go to History. Now the history panel is pretty neat. You get 25 steps, and you can just click back into it to any step. Now, just like in a Marvel movie where like you travel through time, the old future will go away if I change the past. So like if I poke this eyeball, whoop, we can see that that old future went away. It's no longer available to me. So the history panel is not perfect. It can be a little dangerous. You can save history states, but that's not something we're going to cover in this chapter. But it is possible to kind of like save versions within one thing using snapshots in history. So probably what you need to do is you'll come up and click almost all the way back up to the top. In my case, I made quite a few changes, so I can't actually get all the way back. Now, I could actually go back to start by clicking on this very first image, and this would revert it back to the start. But then I lose my crop, and I lose my filter thing. So what I'm going to do instead is my filter thing's already applied, and my crop's already applied. I've got a layer here, so I'm just going to delete the layer. So whichever method you want to use, just delete out all those extra layers, or it's take some steps back in history and get back to where we were with just our filter removal and our expansion from our crop. Okay, let's add in our other two images, and then we're going to go through and hide their backgrounds. So I'm going to come up to File, and I'm going to go to Placed Embedded, and I'm going to grab Decroy number 2, and I'm going to click Place. Now, while he's being placed, I want to flip him because compositionally I want him facing the other way. So I'm just going to go ahead and click do. Now, if you accidentally click done and you can't, where's my flip? Just hit Command or Control T or go up to Edit Free Transform again, and that will bring this back so you can quickly and easily remove it. And for now, I'm just going to throw him here. Just like, get out of my way. And then let's go ahead and throw in my other image. I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go up to Place Embedded. And I'm going to grab the third one where he's shushing. And just like with the guy that looks surprised, I need to flip it. So flip. And you know what? He looks pretty big, so I'm going to shrink him down. And when I'm shrinking him down, I'm going to make him smaller than this guy. And I'll click Done. And you know what would actually probably look pretty good is if this guy was a little bit smaller than the front one, and he was even smaller than that one. So let's go ahead and make that second layer active. So it's this one. I can confirm I've got the right one active by poking it in the eyeball. And I'm going to hit Command T or go to File Free Transform, and I'm going to shrink him down just a little bit. Just so his face is what I'm really looking at. That face is a little bit smaller than that one. And I'll click Return. Okay, let's do some background removal. So I'm going to make the middle one active if it's not still active. And I'm going to grab my Object Select tool, but rather than starting with these object selects, I always want to try a lazy option. Now, I already know Remove Background only does an okay job on this. Like, it's not bad. What we're going to do on both of these instead is come up to where it says Select Subject. I'm going to click the drop down, and I'm going to click Cloud, and this will give better and smoother results for my Select Subject. So I'll click Select Subject now that I've done that Cloud button, and I'll click my Layer Mask button, and I get a cleaner mask. Rinse and repeat for the other one. So I'll make the third guy active. So again, this one. And I'm going to come up here, and for some reason, I always have to click this each time. It kind of drives me up the wall. And I'll click Select Subject, and I'll click Background Removal. And you can see that it is not quite far enough to the right. So I'm going to hit V or click on the Move tool. And I'm going to shift him over to the right a little bit. And that looks pretty good. Now we want kind of like a little elliptical effect going around him that's soft for that transition, and that will kind of help tie him into place. So I need to modify these masks that I've got to have that elliptical appearance. So when I'm working on this next part where I'm going to make an elliptical around both of these guys, I want the mask active, not the layer content. So layer contents, layer mask, contents mask, contents mask. Can't drive that home enough. A lot of people have trouble with that. So all the way up here in the top left, I'm going to grab the elliptical marquee, M. And just like what we did in the last one, I'm going to hold down the Alt Option key, and I'll click about here in his face and draw out an oval. And I'm going to use the space bar to move it down a little bit. And now I'm going to hit the paint bucket, and I'm going to hit fill, but it's not going to do quite what we want. So we want black to hide. We can see that we did the opposite of what we wanted. So we'd want to invert our selection. I hit Command Z or Control Z so I can flip it. We can see that I have this area selected now, so that would hide this arm and hand, part of his hand, but not his face when I come to fill. And now we can see, though, we've got a different problem where this edge right here is kind of hard and nasty. So I'm going to take a couple of steps back to right before my elliptical marquee, and I need to tell it to have a soft edge. Up here at the top where it says feather, this allows me to tell it to have a soft edge. So where it says feather, I'll type in 50. Now, something that's going to be really irritating is in Chapter 6, we're going to come back and use the elliptical marquee tool again. And if you have 50 here, when you come back to this in Chapter 6, you're going to be really frustrated. So once we're done with this, either type out that 0 or remember when we get to Chapter 6, and I'll remind you then, that this feather will mess up a step in that chapter. All right, so now when I click and drag, I get my oval. Let's get it about this big. And when I'm making this oval, I don't want it too close to the bottom because I don't want that hard edge in there. So that's why I am going to eat a little bit of his hand. Then I'm going to invert it. So I can invert it by clicking this button right here or hitting Command or Control Shift I on my keyboard. I can see I have the area around him selected. Now notice that my paint bucket is grayed out, and that's because I have my layer contents active and not my layer mask. So I'll click onto my layer mask, and now I can click my paint bucket and do black. And I'm going to drop this selection by clicking deselect or hitting Command D. That looks pretty good. Now this other one is going to be a little bit harder. So we want to tuck him behind this. So like we got to do that thing that we did in chapter 2 that was kind of that struggle bus where we kind of tucked that sunglasses behind the dog's head. Now it's going to be a little bit easier than it seems like it should be, but it seems like it's going to be harder than it is, but like it won't be too bad. So we'll start by making layer 0 active, our one where it's the guy pointing at us. And I'm going to come back over to my object select. I'm going to click my drop down, pick cloud, and click select subject. We can see that I now have the area that I want tucked behind, that I want to cover this guy selected. I'll come up to here. I'll go to paint bucket and I will do fill black. Fill black, by the way, what we're doing is the same thing as hitting shift delete on your keyboard, and it'll give you the fill menu and you can pick black instead. Or similarly, you can also come up to edit and go to fill to get the same kind of thing. All right, so now he's tucked behind. Command D to drop that selection, and that looks pretty good. But just like with this one, we need to do that kind of soft edging. So I'll grab my elliptical marquee. It still has that 50 in there. And I'm going to Alt-Option drag to get this guy in there, maybe about like so. Again, when I'm drawing my selection, I want to make sure that I'm well away from this nasty hard edge. I'm going to flip my selection, and I'll click Paint Bucket, and I'll pick black, and then hit Command D. And just like magic, he's kind of floating out of there, and that kind of nice effect, and it feels like he's behind the pointing figure. Okay, a lot of 1780s pictures have like this kind of textury background to them, and the background in this one isn't bad, but like we could make it look a little bit more 80s. So I'm going to make layer 0 active, and I'm going to click the new layer button, and I've got this empty layer. Now it's going to start getting confusing about what each one of these layers are, so I'm going to start labeling them. So I've got layer 0. I'm going to double click on where it said layer 0, and I'll type in pointing. This is going to be a clouds layer, so I'll label this clouds. Surprise should be pretty good for this one. That's kind of descriptive of what it is. And then we've got shh for this one. Now we only have 4 layers so far. We'll end up with like 7 or 8 or whatever this chapter ends up with. But you want to be very fastidious about labeling your layers and keeping everything organized. So like later in the semester, we'll have like 2025 chapter, 2025 layer Photoshop documents. And that one, if it's not organized, it just doesn't work. Or like if you're working as part of a team, handing stuff off that's well labeled is polite and necessary. And at some point, like if you just don't do it, you'll get fired. It's like in programming, if you label all of your variables like derp 1 through 50, you're gonna get fired. If you're working as part of a team and your layers are labeled like brightness, contrast, like 1 through 20, you're gonna get fired at some point. So you need to label stuff well. And so keep stuff labeled to get into the habit of it now. It'll be a big thing for you later to make your life easier. So let's add some texture to that background. So I'm going to make that cloud layer active, and we're going to do something pretty neat. So if your foreground and background colors are not the default black and white, click the little black and white right here. So like if I had red active or something like that, I can click on this tiny version of it right here, and I get black and white. Then with this cloud layers active, I'm going to come over to, filter. And I'm going to go to render, and I'm going to pick, do I want clouds or reference clouds? I want clouds. And just like magic, it throws all of this kind of gnarly texture in there. Finally, this looks a little too much, so I'm going to come over to where it says normal, and I'm going to pick soft light. And we can see how that kind of adds a little bit of texture in there, but it's maybe a little too punchy. So where it says opacity, let's kind of turn down the effect of this and set the opacity to 25. And we can see that kind of nice texture that it's adding to the image. However, we don't really want it added to our pointing figure. So let's mask him out of this cloud layer. So I'm going to make the pointing layer active. I'm going to come over to object select. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to pick cloud. And then I'll click select subject. I'm not going to be too worried. Normally we'd want to fix that. Like that's not going to be too big of a deal. Otherwise this looks good enough for our selection. We'll come up to where it says clouds again, and I will click layer mask, and we can see that now is applying it directly to him. Oh no. Now I do this all of the time. I'll make a selection, I'll hit layer mask, and then it's like I've got exactly the wrong thing active. So there's a really easy way to fix it. So if you have your layer mask active, you come up to Image, and you go to Adjustment, and you go to Invert, or hit Command or Control I on your keyboard, and that inverts your layer mask, and now it is applying to the thing that I want. Notice that it is not very visible at all on my, let's switch the move tool so it's easier to see. On my figure, we can see it through the transparent part of him, but up here on his face, we don't see any of that texture coming through because this is below these layers. So remember to keep your layers in order. So let's evaluate our image currently. So when we look at this, we can see that this is a little yellow and green. This is maybe a little too yellow, and this is a little dark. So let's do some adjustments to change the appearance of this to kind of make it look a little bit better. To start with, let's fix the problem of this base layer being too dark. So I'm going to make the pointing layer active again, and I'm going to come down to my adjustment layer button, and I'm going to pick brightness and contrast. In brightness and contrast, we can change these values simply by clicking and dragging on them or typing it in. And I'm going to type in 20 for my brightness and contrast. Now I can temporarily hide and show that edit by clicking the eyeball. And we can see that that helps match it to the other two images. Again, just like with this one, since it is below these layers, it's not having any effect on them. It's only affecting my pointing layer. Next, let's adjust the colors of the paintings. So to adjust the colors of the paintings, I'm going to make Surprise active, and I'm going to make a new type of adjustment. I'm going to go to my little half circle, and I'm going to pick Hue and Saturation. I could, by the way, come up to Image and go to, Layer, and go to New Adjustment Layer, and I could pick Hue Saturation. If I do this method, I get this question right here, but for now, I'll just click OK. If we do it from down here and we do that same adjustment, we see I don't get that secondary window, so it's slightly different, but not any other way than just that. So let's make our adjustment. So here's my layer, and I can come over to my Hue and Saturation slider, and I want to target just the yellows, because right now if I drag hue, it changes all of the color, and I just want to kind of do a little bit about that yellow. So where it says Master, I'm going to pick yellow. Where it says Hue, literally what color, I'm going to set this to be -4, and that'll make it a little bit closer in color than this. We can see though that it's still a little punchy, it's a little saturated. So where it says saturation, I'm going to do -32. If we click the eyeball on and off in this, we can see that it does a pretty dramatic effect. Unfortunately, notice that it is affecting all of the layers underneath it. So it's also grabbing the pointing dude. So I have two options to make it only affect this layer that work out pretty well. I could actually just command click here and turn this into a layer mask here by deleting the layer mask and then clicking layer mask button. And now we can see that it only affects that one layer. Now that's a lot of work, and our goal is always to be as lazy as possible. So let's go back to my hue saturation adjustment. Let's make sure I didn't delete out my yellow. Yep. So -4, -32, it's affecting the whole image. So to not have to jump through those hoops to make a layer mask for this, I can just tell it to only affect the layer directly underneath it. To do that, I can right click on the layer label, and I can pick, come on, where are you? Yeah, there it is, Create Clipping Mask. Boop. And I get a little arrow pointing down. So that says only this layer. So I call it the Hey This Guy button. Another way to do it, because right clicking on stuff is irritating. So I could hold down the Alt Option key and mouse over between it. Notice I get that same down arrow symbol. Or actually over here in the Properties panel, there's a button for it as well that allows me to do the Clipping Mask, is what this is called. Again, I like to call it the Hey Just This Guy button. So now it will only affect the layer directly underneath it. All right, let's rinse and repeat with slightly different settings on the third image, Shush. So make the Shush layer active. Click the half circle and pick Hue Saturation. Click on Master, Yellows. And on this one, we're going to do -4 and -60. So we'll do that same hue adjustment, but then we're going to drop the saturation down much further because this one was much more saturated than the other two. Then I'll go ahead and click the Clipping Mask button, and we can see now that it is only affecting that one layer and that it's really helping match and kind of jive all of these together. Something else that could make this feel a little bit more like an 80s painting is that these background images tend to be a little transparent. So I'm going to make surprise active. And up here under opacity, I'm going to make it kind of ghostly. So I'm going to type in 50. And then, no, I'm dumb. I want this one at 80. I want you at 80. And then I'm going to make shush active. And I'm going to do you at 50. So now we have full opacity, 80% opacity, 50% opacity, which helps create this stepping effect that's accentuated by the sizing that we did earlier. It's like a good trick. Looking at the whole image, I think it might be a little too dark. So I'm going to make the top layer active because I want to add a top layer adjustment to all of this. So I've got my hue saturation, this one active. I'll come down to my adjustments panel, and I'm going to pick another way of changing its appearance. By the way, a really easy way to look at this is here's my fills, here's my brightness and contrast adjustments, here's my color adjustments, and then here's kind of my special uses. It's an easy way to think of this. So I'm going to grab a levels adjustment. And levels adjustment, honestly, is my go-to color edit along with curves. I don't use brightness and contrast very often anymore. I mostly use levels or curves. Levels is pretty neat. So what it does is it gives me this bar graph over here, and I've got 5 rad sliders. So I can click and drag on this left slider, and that adds black to the image, basically saying this darkest tone that's not yet black is now black. Up here at the top, I have a white point slider, and it does the same thing. Please make all the tones that were this tone brighten all the way up to pure white. And then I've got a midpoint slider for darkening or brightening those midpoints. Down here at the bottom, I've got basically the opposite of this, which is please brighten all of these up from the base, or please darken all of these up from the top. Powerfully, and this is going to be a little hard conceptually later, but you should know that it's here, is I can click where it says RGB, and I can pick these different color channels. And I can actually add or subtract red to the image by targeting just the color channels. People who get very good at color adjustment will use this along with curves to do a lot of their color adjustment rather than like hue saturation or something else, because it's a really powerful way of editing colors, but it's a little abstract for right now, and hue saturation is pretty easy. Okay, so let's brighten the image. So I've got this white point slider over here, and it's currently set to 255. We're going to set it instead to 233. And if I click this on and off, we can see that that just kind of helps add contrast in here. Now, how I decided to make this edit is I looked at this bar graph and I saw that there weren't any tones at 255 yet. So what we basically did is we dragged this over, and 233 was the brightest tone. And what we've done now is told tone 233 to be 255. So it's brightened the image out. Which is a really handy, easy way to kind of fill either like your black or your white tones. This levels adjustment is brilliant. Whew, that's a lot so far. Got some more to do though. We need to add our text and then add a couple of legibility tricks to make that text a little bit easier to read. So, stylized 1780s are back. Click on the text tool, and I want Arial black again. If yours just says Arial, you might need to pick black out of this dropdown. For my sizing, I'm going to do 180, and I don't care about the rest of this stuff. And I'm just going to kind of click somewhere down here for now because I can adjust the placement in a minute. And I am going to type in what's the exact text? The 1780s. No apostrophe. Are back. There we go. I'm going to switch to the move tool so I can move it, and I'm just going to drag it about here for now. We'll putz with you in a second. Let's add some layer styles to this. So with this layer still active, I'm going to click on the FX button, and I want to pick, let's start with stroke. We can see that that's adding a black stroke around it right now. Again, we're going to add a fill here in a second, so it'll make a little bit more sense. Where it says size, I'm going to do 20. Where it says position, I want outside. In almost every instance, I found outside is the position that you want, and very few will you ever use inside or center. We'll leave blend mode alone. We'll leave opacity alone. Color, we're going to click on this box, and we just want an obnoxious pink. I don't really care which one you pick. Ooh, yeah, look at that. That is obnoxious. That's a nice obnoxious color. I'm going to click OK. Now, without closing it, we're going to do a couple more adjustments in here. So I'm going to come down to Gradient Overlay. And in Gradient Overlay, I want some more obnoxious colors. So I'm going to click on this drop down. And we got something in purples. Will that work? It's going to be in pinks. Ooh, yeah, that last one in pinks looks good. All right. So click on that one in pinks, and we're going to leave the rest of these settings alone. And finally, we're going to add a very subtle drop shadow behind this. So we're going to go to drop shadow. You can see that it already gives us one from earlier, and we've got a bunch of settings to put in. So where it says 30 right here for angle, I'm going to do 120. Otherwise, this should be multiply, this should be black, this should be 100. Use global light, yes, that's fine. Global light just says that if I have other effects in here, it will match the angle for it. Distance, I'm going to do 75. I'm hitting tab to move between these boxes. 10% and 20%. And we can see that that kind of lifts the text up off of the surface in this kind of nice three-dimensional appearance. And I'm going to click OK. Now, finally, this is kind of not great looking, so we're going to stretch the text out. So I'm going to hit Command or Control T on my keyboard. And now I can, why can't I stretch? I'm just making it bigger. So to stretch it while I'm dragging, so after I've started clicking, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and that allows it to drag. Now notice that the gradient is looking goofy in there. Once I release this, it is going to fix that gradient. I'm just going to drag up so it's about this big. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'll click done, and we can see the gradient updated on the inside. And I'm going to drag this back down. Ooh, it's still a lot. We're not quite done yet. So finally, we want to add one more darkening effect. So if let me switch tools so we don't see that kind of bounding box. Although you can actually hide the bounding box. There it is. You can turn off show transforms, and that will start hiding those boxes. For us, we'll just leave them on because it's handy. So marquee tool, so it goes away though. So notice how bright it is down here at the bottom. So like if I hide see this brightness down here, if I made that area darker, and that's part of what's happening with that shadow, that'll make this easier to read. So I want to add a layer that will darken this bottom section. So I'm going to click on levels, and I'm going to go over to my adjustment layer button. Although you can actually grab them now out of this panel of all things. They added this panel like a year ago. And I'm going to click on brightness and contrast. In brightness and contrast, I'm going to make a pretty big adjustment. I'm going to do -60, and we can see that that darkens the image up quite a bit. Now, I don't actually want to darken the whole image. I just want to darken this bottom section. So to darken just that bottom section, I'm going to draw a gradient in this area. Because remember, white will have no effect, black will have full effect, and then anything in between will transition it to full or no effect. So I'll hit G or click on the gradient tool. I'll make sure that I've got black to white up here. If it's not, click on the drop down and go to basics and pick this first option. And then we just simply need to click and drag. So I'm going to make sure this layer mask is active. I'm going to click at the bottom of the layer, and I'm going to drag up. And while I'm dragging up, I'm going to hold the Shift key until I hit his finger, and then I'm going to release. Now you can see I did that thing where I did it backwards again. I actually have the opposite of what I wanted to have happen. So I could hit Command or Control I and just invert the mask, and that worked really easily. Or I could come over here to my layers panel and click layer visibility or whatever yours happens to be, whatever's right before draw gradient, and click on the finger and drag down while dragging down holding the Shift key to get that same effect. So you can either undo it and redo it, or you can always hit Command I just to flip your mask, whichever way is easier for you. Now, just like with the other two chapters, we want to save our PSD. So I'm going to come up to File, and I'm going to go to Save As. I'm going to throw this on my desktop so I can delete it here in a second. And where it says Decroy 1, I'll type in Done, and I want to click Save. If this pops up, you can say Don't Show Again, click OK. And now you've got this PSD. Now, by saving a PSD, these layers will stay available. So at any point, you can come back and be like, maybe I didn't darken this enough, or I'm going to do that though. Or like maybe I actually want the whole thing to be brighter. That's the power of using layers, is all these changes we've made can be adjusted ad nauseum. Like I can just keep doing it and it's not going to damage anything. So like in some tutorials, you'll see people talking about going to image adjustments and using these. And I would mostly avoid these, because if you do it and you save and close, you can't change it later. Or if you decide that you want it darker and darker and brighter and then darker and brighter again, I can do that ad nauseum here in the levels thing, and it's okay. It's not going to really hurt that much. If I keep doing that from this menu up here, each time I do that, the image will get a little crummier. So we want to use layers to keep stuff from getting crummy. Now this is a meme, and memes are designed to be shared. You should send them to people, but I can't send them a PSD. I have to send them something shareable. To do that, I'll come up to File, and I'm going to pick Save a Copy. And you can thank Apple for Save a Copy. They changed how their system works, so now we have Save a Copy instead of Save As. So we'll use Save a Copy. And where it says Format, I'm going to click on the Photoshop, and I'm going to pick JPEG. Not 2000, not stereo, but just regular JPEG. Notice up here at the top, the file label changes to .jpeg, so that's perfect. I'm going to delete out copy. There's a way to have it not do that in preferences if that bothers you, or you can just delete it out each time, whichever way you want to do it. And I'll click Save, and that now gives me a JPEG on my desktop. If you get JPEG options, unless you're going for a very small file size, just max this out and click OK. And now I have a pretty big JPEG that I could send somebody and they could open and view it. All right, for this do-it-yourself, pretty much do exactly the same thing, except using 3 images or an object along with a background. So you can use ones I provided or find your own. It doesn't really matter too much. Background should be fully removed. You should use adjustment layers to make sure everything kind of starts matching a little bit. You won't get it perfect yet because this is just chapter 3. Add text. Your text should use at least 2 styles. Your text, or you can add a border, should be filled with some sort of graduation. Text should be sized appropriately, elements positioned well, and then save a PSD and a JPEG with a descriptive file name like chapter 3 done DYO or something else like that. Again, the goal is to make it so it's easy to understand what that file is later. Okay, so now's a good time to talk about this. We need to talk a little bit about file formats, because we saw a couple types of layers that were doing kind of weird things. Like we had a vector layer and text layer, and we had these other kind of raster image layers. So what does that mean, and like how do I share these images, and how do I edit stuff? So Photoshop is what we call a raster image editor. And that isn't to say that it can't do vector, which we'll talk about here in a second, but it's targeted at editing raster images. A raster image is an image made up of hundreds or millions of little squares that we call pixels. Each pixel is made up of a subpixel of red, green, and blue that mix together to create the illusion of our continuous tones. So like up here, we can see a zoom in of the llama's eye, and we can see that it's made up of these little squares, aka pixels. And we can see that this is a pixel version of this llama, because if I zoom all the way in, we can see those little squares. Oops, wrong button. So these kind of images are really good for continuous tones and high details, like this kind of starscape here in the background. This is what raster is really stellar for. Now, this image was actually made in Illustrator with an embedded raster in it, and Illustrator is what's called a vector editing program. And a vector editing program makes little areas that you can fill in and based on these lines that I can also stroke. So in Photoshop, I can also make vectors, although not as easily as I can in Illustrator. So I can grab like the shape tool, and here's a vector. We can see the vector has a fill and it has a stroke, and I have these little lines going around it and little anchor points that allow me to quickly change and edit the appearance of my shape, which is really neat. Now, why wouldn't I just use these if it's so easy to change their appearance? And the answer is I can't do like high detail continuous tones. Like I can stroke this, I can change the color, and it's super easy. But I can't do this background with vector. Like at some point, what I would just end up having been doing is just basically making a anchor point for each pixel, and then I've kind of defeated the purpose of it. So like if we go into Illustrator where this was made, we can see that I've pulled apart my llama here, and it is made up of these blocks. And unlike in the other one, here, let's just take a couple steps back, restore it to where it was. If I hit Z for zoom tool and I zoom in on this, at no point am I going to get pixels, because this is just math. There's no mapping of pixels. It's not a bitmap. It's not a raster. But like if I zoom in on my background image, we can see that this is a raster embedded in my vector file. And again, it's made up of those little individual pixels. Okay, so raster, big advantage here is lots and lots of nice detail. Major disadvantage is that it's not as editable. So each time I change it, it will get a little bit worse, especially if I'm doing destructive edits without layers. Vector, big advantage, I can infinitely rescale it, and it's really easy for me to change its appearance and placement and color and all these other things, but I can't do these kind of awesome high detailed photographic images or paintings. One other advantage of vector is that it's much smaller in size versus a raster image, which will be much larger in file size in terms of like storing the image on my computer. In this workbook, we're mostly going to focus on raster because that's what Photoshop is really good for. So with raster files, there's a couple of more attributes that can affect file size and quality. So one of them is whether or not we are lossless versus lossy. So all of us have been browsing social media enough or on the internet enough that we see these kind of really nasty, crunchy looking images. And in fact, it might even be an image that we've seen before. And the one we saw before looked cleaner and sharper than the one we see currently. So in order to help with file size, especially for stuff that's supposed to be shared on the internet, we have lossy versus lossless. And a lossy file, each time I save or copy or download it or resize it or blah, 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 it's going to get worse very rapidly. Like we have images from, the more it gets accessed, the more it degrades. Versus a lossless image, where is it? There it is, where I can do that as many times as I want, and I'm not going to see that same kind of degradation of images. Like if I'm rescaling it a bunch, I'll see some degradation. That's kind of the drawback of rescaling. But like I can save, copy, close it a lot without or download it and upload it and download it and upload it over and over again without seeing a large, rapid degradation in quality. Now, just like with raster versus vector, lossless takes up a lot more room than lossy because lossy compresses itself when you're working with it, and that's part of what makes it so much smaller. Similarly, we have bit depth. So we have 16-bit and we have 8-bit. So when you look at an 8-bit image, you can see that I've got this kind of nasty lines in here. And if we look at this simulated 16-bit, because I can't export this video in 16-bit actually, we see this kind of nice smooth gradient. Any grain that you see in here is me simulating that 16-bit, by the way. Now, it only sounds like there's like twice the difference between these, but the naming of this is a little disingenuous. So when I'm looking at this image, what I'm really seeing is an image made up of red, green, and blue pixels that where each of those subpixels can have a value between 0 and 255, making for a possibility of 16,777,216 possible colors or steps. That sounds like a lot, but when you get smooth gradients, particularly in grays and blues, you're going to see these kind of nasty hard edges. Sometimes they'll call it posterization as well in photography. Versus 16-bit, where I have 2 to the 16th possible steps, so way more possibilities for each individual color step, I end up with way smoother gradients, but I also end up with significantly larger file sizes. Now, functionally, for most images, 8-bit is going to be fine. But if you're ever in doubt, you will just start working in 16-bit, and we'll look at how to set that up in later chapters at the start. And by working in 16-bit, you'll have your smooth gradients, and then you can downgrade it to 8-bit and be like, how does this look down in 8-bit? And if it looks fine, then you can leave it in 8-bit, and you don't have to worry about posterization. If you drop it down to 8-bit and you see this posterization, then you're going to be in a little bit of a fight. Either you have to keep it in 16-bit, limiting you in your file types, or you're going to kind of have to jerry-rig it. So like the resolution on this is smaller, so it's not going to work as well in this version. But if I go to filter and noise and add noise, I can add noise to this. And you can see that it starts smoothing out that gradient at the cost of adding in these kind of little randomized dots. So that's one way around it. So 8-bit, possibility of these hard steps, much smaller file sizes. 16-bit, smooth gradient, much larger file sizes, and not all of the file types we'll be looking at support 16-bit. Like that's why I had to fake it here for this video. Finally, in terms of just like appearance qualities, we also have transparency. So if I grab Mr. Potato here and I do remove background, and I want to be able to put this into a design later where the background is transparent. So like we can see through, we can see past him. This mask either is applied or it's in the file. If I need that transparent background, I need to use a file type that supports transparency. So like if I'm in PNG, this background will stay transparent, marked by these kind of squares. Versus if I'm in JPEG, the background will be filled in white to my canvas edge. Okay, so lots of stuff there. We also have another problem with raster, which is resolution. So vector, I can infinitely scale all I want. Raster, I only have so many pixels. And each time I reduce the number of pixels, I'm not going to get those back without introducing new problems. Oh, look, there's a little bit of banding in this Photoshop one from being an 8-bit. Isn't that cute? All right, file size. So we have like the number of pixels that make up the actual image. Like we can see that this one is made up of 600 to 900 pixels versus this one, which is made up of 144 to 216 pixels. And we can see when presented, oh, this is a little big. Let's do you at 100%. So here, this is at 100% on my screen. Here, this is the same image, except with fewer pixels, presented at 100% on my screen. So we can see that it's just not as large on my screen. So number of pixels, and we call the number of pixels resolution. It's not 100% a hard term. Like you'll see it get used a little goofily on the internet, but resolution is like how many pixels are in the image. High resolution, lots of pixels. Low resolution, low number of pixels. In photography, we rate these based on megapixels, literally millions of pixels. So like a 640 by 480 pixel image is 307 200 pixels, or about 0.3072 megapixels. So a lot of cameras these days are like in the 20 to 50 megapixel range, giving you a lot of information to work with. Now, related to my just straight up how many pixels are in my image or my resolution, I also have another way of talking about resolution, which is how are those pixels displayed. So like in print, I would want, for like a high quality photo, I'd want 300 ppi. And ppi stands for pixels per inch. So literally the number of pixels I place over 1 inch of my image. On the internet, it used to be like 72. Now our screens are much denser, so it matters less. But in print, it matters a lot. So 300 for like a really nice one. And then if you're exporting to a certain file, to a certain use, like it might go way down from there. Or like if you're printing digital transparencies, you might need to even go further up. Now, irritatingly, when you're on the internet reading about this PPI thing, you'll see people talk about DPI. So a lot of people on the internet will say DPI when they mean PPI, and it drives us up the wall. So DPI is dots per inch and refers to how those pixels are getting converted to like a halftone or other print processes, or LPI, like lines per inch. And that is very separate from PPI. So if you see those terms getting thrown around, don't get confused. The internet's confused about it, and people will often use it wrong. Now, like a really easy way to think about PPI is like I can have this be about the same size as the other image. So if I zoom in and we look at this image, yeah, they're about the same size on my screen, right? And this one appears much smoother because it's made up of more pixels, and this one appears pixelated because it has fewer pixels displayed over the same area. So if you want to avoid this pixelization, make sure you work in high resolution. Now, unfortunately, I can't just upscale this back up to the size of the other ones. Like I can go to image size, and if I reassign this to be, 900 by 600, boop. And let's put this at 100%. And we have this one at 100%. We can see that trying to upscale that back up doesn't work out as well. Now, there's new AI ones that are doing a much better job than just the quick one I did here in Photoshop. But you can't really bring back pixels. Now, the number of pixels also affect file size. The more pixels you have, the more room it takes up on your computer. Okay, so let's say I want to save this guy. So we've got a bunch of file types that you're going to use as a professional image editor or like a professional artist. And these are ones that you just have to know. And then outside of this, depending on where you go, you might have to learn more of them. So if I go up to File and I go to Save a Copy, and I'm going to use Save a Copy here because that will give me full access to all of my file types. When I do Save As or Save will just save it what it currently has. And then Save As will only give you file types that it could be based on the current document settings. So we will do Save as a Copy because it will duplicate the file and allow you to use any of these file types. So one we care about is Photoshop. This is your storage file format. If you have layers, you're going to want to save it as Photoshop because then you get to keep your layers. Very large file sizes, also supports vector. Similarly, a .ai or a .ind are Adobe Illustrator and Adobe InDesign. Then we have JPEG, which this is currently saved as, and JPEG should be your go-to format. So JPEG, unfortunately, is lossy, 8-bit, and very small in file size. By being those three things, it is very, very, very shareable on the web, and everyone supports it. It's very cool. A file size that we will look at next chapter is Camera, so we'll hit more of that later, but it's a special raster format that is the raw data from the camera, and then it will get interpreted by Adobe Camera Raw. Now, if I want to save this and have a background removed, so I'm just going to remove the background, and let's just save a copy, and we'll save this one as a JPEG, throw this on my desktop, boop, boop, and I try to look at it on my desktop, we can see that it added that white background I was talking about. Versus if I go up to File and I do a Save a Copy, and I go to PNG, and I click Save, and let's go back to that folder, and we can see, oh, where did it save? Did it save to the, oh, yep, saved it into my, saved it in the wrong spot. Let's make my PNG and save. And if I look at it on this one, we can see that I have a transparent background. It's a very easy way to think about the two. Now, PNG, quote unquote, tries to fix the problems of JPEG. So like it is lossless, which means I can save and close it as many times as I want without losing any quality. It supports alpha transparency, and it supports 16-bit. None of those things are true for 8-bit. However, if we look at the file sizes, we can see that this is 329 kilobytes and this is 105 kilobytes. Even though I just saved the same image, the file size between the two is already pretty significant. A file type that we'll take a look at chapter 9 is going to be GIF. It's an old file type, so we won't get too far into it, but it's a lot like JPEG, not JPEG, it's a lot like GIF, except usually more limited in color, and it also supports animation, which will be really fun when we make our little goofy GIF animations. We also have SVG, which won't be listed in here, which is a file type for vector graphics. So when you come across an SVG, you can kind of think of it as a JPEG for vector. If you do a lot in Illustrator, you're going to have to learn the format. We also have Photoshop PDF. In this case, this is just .pdf. PDF you can think of as a shareable Photoshop file would be the best way to think about it. So like my vectors stay vector, my rasters are rasters, and then importantly, my text is text. So like if you want to be able to copy text off of an image, you can do that in PDF as long as it was saved as a text file in a PDF. Like you can still convert it to a raster in a PDF. It's like it drives designers up the wall when somebody converts a JPEG to a PDF and sends it to you. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. One other file type that we should talk about, and I'm sure you have come across, is our compression files. So I have, all of my files right here. So let's say I was going to send you, the core concepts files. Rather than attaching 5 files for you to download to an email or putting up 5 links, I can right click on this and pick compress, and this creates a zip file. So this .zip file is neat because it took all those files, it put them into a single file, and then if they were lossy, it also compressed them a little bit so they take up less room on a computer for downloading. Now, to open up a .zip file, you simply double click on it like what you did at the start to get these files, and it will uncompress it. And we'll practice making compressed zip files in chapter 4 and 5 because you'll be doing a lot with RAW with many files that will need to be sent all at once, and it takes too long to upload and download that many files all at once. So there's a big reference to this in the PDF that comes with this textbook. read through it if you need more information on this, or if you forget some of the details. It's all there for you, and hopefully this wasn't too confusing. The takeaway should be JPEG, universal file format, share with everybody, but loses quality. Vector, infinitely rescalable, made up of math, and then save your master documents as Photoshop files. All right, good luck.